Okay, Hatchet Chapter 10. Eddied is any similar current as of air, dust, or fog. Something eddied in the story. And dormant is a state of rest or inactivity, so if you stay inside, you are dormant. For the questions, why didn't Brian want to leave the fire? It's going to tell us why he didn't want to leave the fire. 2, there was a surprise benefit to having the fire. We have to figure out what that was. Number 3, what did Brian realize when he looked back at his shelter and saw the smoke lifting through the trees? Okay, so he realized something when he saw that. Why did Brian need to regulate his sleep? Regulate means to have a schedule or consistency in his sleep. He does this for a certain reason. And what did Brian discover that was making noise during the night? He could not leave the fire at first. It was so precious to him, so close and sweet a thing. The yellow and red flames brightened the dark interior of the shelter, the happy crackle of the dry wood as it burned. But he could not leave it. He went to the trees and bought as many dead limbs as he could drop and carry, and then he had a large pile and set them near the fire. Though it was getting into the warm middle part of the day, and he was hot, and broke them into small pieces and fed the fire. So he says that the fire is precious to him. It's sweet. He said that it crackled happily. And he said it was his friend, so he wants to keep it going. I will not let you go out, he said to himself. To the flames, not ever. And so he sat through a long part of the day, keeping the flames even, eating from stacks of raspberries, leaving to drink from the lake when he was thirsty. In the afternoon toward evening, with his face smoke smeared and his skin red hot from the heat, he finally began to think ahead what he needed to do. He would need a large wood pile to get through the night. It would be almost impossible to find wood in the dark, and he would have it all and cut and stacked before the sun went down. Brian made certain the fire was banked with new wood. Then he went out the shelter and searched for a good fuel supply. Up the hill from the campsite, the same windstorm that left him a place to land the plane had only been there 3-4 days ago, had dropped 3 large white pines across each other. They were all dead now, dry and filled with weathered, dry, dead limbs, enough for many days. He chopped and broke and carried wood back to the camp, stacking the pieces under the overhang, until he had what he thought to be an enormous pile, as high as his head, and 6 feet across the base. Between trips, he added small pieces to the fire to keep it going, and on one of the trips to get wood, he noticed he had an advantage of the fire. So right here, he's going to tell us why the fire was actually an advantage. When he was in the shade of the trees breaking the limbs, the mosquitoes swarmed him, as usual. But when he came back to the fire, or just near the shelter where the smoke eddied and swirled, the insects were gone. So typically you don't see mosquitoes during the day, you only see them at night when the sun is down. So the fire also kept the bugs away. It was a wonderful discovery. The mosquitoes had nearly driven him mad, and he thought of being rid of them lifted his spirits. On another trip he looked back and saw the smoke curling up through the trees and realized, for the first time, that he now had means to make a signal. He could carry a burning stick and build a fire signal on top of the rock, make clouds of smoke, and perhaps attract attention. So typically when people are stranded, they make a signal of smoke from a fire in order for people to find them. So now he has to come up with a plan, which meant more wood and still more wood. There did not seem to be an end to the wood he would need, and he spent all the rest of the afternoon into dusk making wood chips. At dark, he settled in again for the night, next to the fire with the stack of short pieces ready to put on, and he ate the rest of the raspberries. During all the work of the day, his leg had loosened, but it still ached a bit. Remember, he got quilled by the porcupine, so his leg was hurting. And he rubbed it and watched the fire as though for the first time since the crash, that he might be getting a handle on things, might be starting to do something other than just sit. He was out of food, but he could look tomorrow and he could build a signal fire tomorrow and get more wood tomorrow. The fire cut the night coolness and settled him back into sleep, thinking of tomorrow. He slept hard and wasn't sure what awakened him, but his eyes came open and he stared into the darkness. The fire had burned down and looked out, but he stirred it with a piece of wood and found a bed of coals still glowing red and hot, with small pieces of wood and carefully blowing. He soon had a blaze going again. So what happened was he fell asleep and the fire started to go out. So he has to figure out a plan. It hadn't been close. He had to be sure to try and sleep in short intervals so he could keep the fire going. And he tried to think of a way to regulate his sleep, but it made him sleepy to think about it. And he was just going to go under again when he heard the sound outside. It was not unlike the sound of the porcupine, something slithering and being dragged across the sand. But when he looked out the door opening, it was too dark to see anything. Whatever it was stopped making the sound in a few moments, and he thought he heard something sloshing in the water at the shoreline. But he had a new fire now and plenty of wood, so he wasn't as worried as he had been the night before. He dozed, slept for a time, awakened again just at dawn gray light, and added wood to the still smoking fire before standing outside and stretching, standing with his arms stretched over his head and the tight knot of hunger in his stomach. He looked down toward the lake and saw the tracks. They were strange, a main center line up from the lake in the sand, with claw marks on the side, leading into a small pile of sand, then going back down into the water. Can you guess what the animal is? Claws into the sand and then had to go back into the water. Let's see. He walked over and squatted near them, studied them, tried to make sense of them. Whatever had made tracks in some kind of flat, dragging bottom in the middle was apparently pushed along by the legs that stuck out the side. Up from the water to the small pile of sand, then back down into the water. Some animal, some kind of water animal that came up to the sand. To do what? To do something with the sand. To play and make a pile in the sand? He smiled. City boy, he thought. Oh, you city boy with your city ways. He made a mirror in his mind, a mirror of himself, and saw how he must look. City boy with your city ways, sitting in the sand, trying to read the tracks, not knowing, not understanding. Why would anything wild come up from the water to play in the sand? Not that way. Animals weren't that way. They didn't waste time that way. It had come up from the water for a reason, a good reason, and he must try to understand the reason. He must change to fully understand the reason himself, or he would not make it. He had to figure out what it was, because if not, it could hurt him and he wouldn't know how to protect himself. It had come up from the water for a reason, and that reason, he thought, squatting, the reason had to do with the pile of sand. He brushed off the top gently with his hand, but found only damp sand. Still, there must be a reason, and he carefully kept scraping and digging until, about 4 inches down, he suddenly came into a small chamber in the cool, damp sand, and there lay eggs, many eggs, almost perfectly round eggs the size of a table tennis ball. Ping pong balls. Table tennis is ping pong, so little ping pong ball-sized eggs. And he laughed because then he knew. It had been a turtle. He had seen a show on television about sea turtles that came up to the beaches and laid their eggs in the sand. There must be freshwater lake turtles that did the same. Maybe snapping turtles. He had heard of snapping turtles. They became fairly large, he thought. It must have been a snapper that came up in the night when he heard the noise that awakened him. She must have came up and laid the eggs. Food. More than eggs, more than knowledge, and more than anything was food. His stomach tightened and rolled and made a noise as he looked at the eggs. as if his stomach belonged to somebody else or had seen the eggs with his own eyes and was demanding food. The hunger, always there, had been somewhat controlled and dormant when there was nothing to eat, but with the eggs came the scream to eat. His whole body craved food with such intensity that it quickened his breath. He reached into the nest and pulled out the eggs one at a time. There were 17 of them, each round as a ball and white. They had leathery shells that gave instead of breaking when he squeezed them, so they were soft, or like shells are soft. When he had heaped them on the sand into a pyramid, he had never felt so rich somehow. He suddenly realized he did not know how to eat them. He had a fire, but no way to cook them, no container. He had never thought of eating a raw egg. He had an uncle named Carter, his father's brother, who always put an egg in a glass of milk and drank it in the morning. Brian had watched him do it once, just once, when the runny part in the white left the glass and went into his uncle's mouth and down his throat in a single gulp. Brian almost lost everything he had ever eaten. Still, he thought, still, as his stomach moved toward his backbone and he became less and less fuzzy. Some natives in the world eat grasshoppers and ants, and if they could do anything that could get a raw egg down. So let's take a second here. Brian found turtle eggs outside, and he is trying to decide if he should eat them. No, he's not going to cook them. He's remembering the story about his uncle where he ate a raw egg right from a glass. They crack it into the glass and eat it. Some people do that, but it's not healthy. So he has to decide if he's going to do that or not. So let's find out. He picked up one and tried to break the shell, and found it surprisingly tough. Finally, using the hatchet, he sharpened a stick and poked a hole in the egg. He widened the hole with his finger and looked inside. Just an egg. It had a dark yellow yolk, and not so much white as he thought there would be. Just an egg? Food. Just an egg he had to eat, raw. He looked across the lake and brought the egg to his mouth and closed his eyes and sucked and squeezed the egg at the same time and swallowed it as fast as he could. Eugh. It had a greasy, almost oily taste, but it was still an egg. His throat tried to throw it back up. His whole body seemed to convulse with it. Convulse is like that feeling when you eat something that's really, really gross and you get like shivers throughout your body and you kind of want to throw it back up. So that's what his body did, but his stomach took it, held it, and demanded more. The second egg was easier, and by the third one, he had no trouble at all. It just slid down. He ate 6 of them, could have easily eaten all of them and not been full. But a part of him said to hold back, save the rest. Oh, I can't believe he did that. He could not now believe the hunger. The eggs had awakened it fully, roaringly, so that it tore at him. After the 6th egg, he ripped the shell open and licked the inside clean, then went back and ripped the 5 open and licked them out, and well wondered if he could eat the shells. There must have been some food value in them, but when he tried, they were too leathery to chew and he couldn't get them down. He stood away from the eggs for a moment, literally stood and turned away, so that he could not see them. If he looked at them, he would have eaten more. He would store them in the shelter and only eat one a day. He fought the hunger down again, controlled it. He would take them now and store them and save them and eat one a day. And he realized as he thought that had forgotten that they might come, the searchers. Surely they would come before he could eat all the eggs in one day. He had forgotten to think about them, and that wasn't good. He had to keep thinking of them, because if he forgot them and he didn't think of them, they might forget about him. And if they keep hoping, he had to keep hoping. Alright, so Brian found the eggs and he was eating the turtle eggs. And with this huge discovery, he forgot about one of the most important things, and it's being able to light that fire for the searchers, the people to come find him.